tea and coffee next door, so we'll have about 20 minutes for morning tea and we'll reconvene for area questions. Okay, I'd like to introduce Dr. Terry Heppenstall, who's going to talk to us about the response to intervention model and effective methods of reading instruction.
Thank you. Can you hear me clearly at the back? We have amplification. We've got it all now. Response to intervention. Intervention, check response. Sounds pretty straightforward. The method of science, of course, that one assesses whether there's an issue, devises an intervention and checks to see whether that's a worthwhile intervention. Methods of science, however, have been not strongly influencing educational policy ever, and one only has to look at the quality of educational research, some of which Tom referred to earlier today, to see that it has until relatively recently been difficult to make decisions about what is effective, what actually does work. Response to intervention is about seeking what can be done given the resources that one has in a school setting. There are two major areas in which response to intervention has been developed, and it's really only been in the last 10 years or so that this has become something of a groundswell. And it was initially a special education initiative in which people were discontented with the typical way of assessing whether someone has a learning disability, which was called the discrepancy definition, in which a child who might have high ability but low attainment in a basic skill area could be categorised as having a learning disability, as opposed to another child who may be just slow. The definition has run into all sorts of difficulties, and I don't have time to talk about that particular meaning of response to intervention today. I want to look at it more in terms of the school-wide approach, that is, how is response to intervention likely to be useful in the general education system as opposed to just in special education. It should be noted, however, and just to relieve any uncertainty, that this is not set up as a contrast to reading recovery, even though both titles are in the, both terms are in the title. Response to intervention is not a program. It's not something that you can just pick up off the shelf and introduce. It's a framework. It's a way of looking at the identification and intervention for children who are struggling. This is a relatively recent definition, and it's as good as any other definition. The important features there are to notice that it's an integrated system in which assessment and intervention take place, and they are very tightly linked. It's meant to have several levels of intervention, and certainly Tom talked about that, in which reading recovery might have been seen as a final intervention, but only after other levels of intervention had been trialled and unsuccessful. And the idea behind that is if you're able to make a difference to a proportion, hopefully a large proportion of children who may be struggling, then you don't need the extensive resources of reading recovery for such a large number. Another feature is that data is what drives the program or the approach. Data is collected regularly and helps to make decisions about whether a program, an intervention is successful or not, but it's also part of the assessment aspect of response to intervention. So the general idea is schools would use data to identify students at risk before they've had the chance of failing, to be able to monitor student progress with something more extensive than just end of term or end of year reports. The next bit is a tricky bit, and that is that schools need to be providing evidence-based approaches in the initial teaching of reading, or indeed other basic skills and in fact behaviour as well. They need to provide these evidence-based interventions. This has not been something that has been strongly pushed in education until relatively recently, and we're beginning to see it in other countries. They're perhaps in Great Britain and in the US a little further advanced than we are in recognising what evidence-based interventions are. And towards the end of your handout, you'll see a list of places where you might be able to investigate which interventions do indeed have an evidence base. Not just being based on scientific approaches, say, to literacy, but actually those that have empirical evidence that they do work. We saw with John's talk the big 5 components of reading, of skilled reading, and that they should form part of our both our assessment and our intervention programs. Those big 5 should be driving what it is that we are doing. However, just because a program has some components of one or more or all of those big 5 doesn't necessarily mean that it is demonstrably effective. There needs to be independent studies on those programs to see whether indeed it is a good mix and is well designed and sufficient to make a significant change to children's progress. It expects that if an intervention is not being very successful, then that should become evident through the data that's collected, and it should also lead to changes in the intervention. And that could be to do with changing the intensity or the duration of an intervention, rather than simply swapping from one whole intervention to another. It may be possible to make changes within an intervention by changing some of the variables within it. And this all depends on the student's responsiveness, hence response to intervention. And the definition also talks about identifying students with learning disabilities. In Victoria, there isn't such a category, and so the notion of using response to intervention as an alternative to discrepancy analyses is perhaps not as important in Victoria, though it still is in other states in which learning disabilities is recognised as a funded situation, a funded condition. There are some assumptions that one needs to make clear. The first is that all students can learn, that a student's biology, that which they bring to the setting, nor their SES or family backgrounds precludes success in learning. Sometimes it can be an excuse that's used conveniently when a child doesn't make progress. As John's work has highlighted, the quality of instruction is a major contributor to student outcome. And it's by manipulating those components, the quality of instruction, that we have the opportunity to make a real difference for children. There is a predictable relationship between instructional quality and learning outcomes, and there is plenty of evidence about what constitutes effective teaching and also the sort of gross differences that can occur between a teacher who is skilled with a program and a teacher who is unskilled. The assumption here too is that the beginning teaching of reading, that is right from the early stages in prep, that evidence-based interventions will form the first part of a teaching sequence. We see too often in our schools children early in year 1 being assessed and recommended for reading recovery programs, and far too many are in that position. The Auditor General in, I think it was 2006, said that something like 40 to 50% of our year 1 students are recommended for reading recovery. There is something wrong with our initial teaching if that sort of proportion of students are after only 1 year in dire straits. Some of the other causal variables that we are able to manipulate, are able to include in interventions. Intensity is an important one, and that can be done by increasing the academic engaged time that a student spends in a basic skill. It could be to do with the lesson frequency. One might be offering a child 3 lessons of 20 minutes a week because that's all you can afford at the time. And when collecting data, you find that progress is minimal. It may be that it's not the program that's the problem, it's the intensity of the program needs to be built up in order to get the sort of success you see. Sometimes, what we've already seen with reading recovery, there can be a washout effect some time after the conclusion of the program. And that's an unfortunate outcome. I've spoken to many teachers in around Year 4 referring children for a program that I have often used called corrective reading, one of the correct instruction programs. And they say these children went through reading recovery, but I can't tell the difference now between those who did reading recovery and those struggling students who didn't. So part of the issue of the washout effect that can be resolved is continuing to maintain data on student progress and reintroducing programs, either similar or different, but accepting that for some children increased program duration may be a requirement. Not just 12 to 20 weeks, but it's possible that you may get much better effects if the program or similar is increased over the period of presentation. The size of the group's been referred to a couple of times. One-to-one is extraordinarily expensive, and if it were extraordinarily more effective than small group instruction, then one might say, well, that's too bad, that's the cost. But there is plenty of evidence now that small group instruction can be at least as effective as one-to-one, at least for your medium strugglers. Maybe for your very bottom strugglers, you may need to go to one-to-one. Engagement of students, the degree to which a teacher is able to engage the students. We saw a nice graph, I think it was in Tom's presentation, myself or John's, engagement and attainment, although that was another word. The two are interlinked. Unfortunately, in education, some people have felt that the only direction to take is to have programs that engage children, and then their competence will develop as a consequence of the teacher engaging them. But the other, because it's a reciprocal relationship, the other variable that you can change is to ensure that attainment is improved and then watch engagement become established. And so that then becomes a self-teaching or self-reinforcing cycle. Lesson pacing, the speed with which you cover material, the amount of practice that you provide. We've heard already today about the importance of practice. What criteria do you set for mastery before moving on to the next component in your program? How many response opportunities does the child have in your intervention? I can remember sitting in on a corrective reading program, and in the first 10 minutes of the phonics part of that program, the child next to me responded more than 300 times in 10 minutes. That's an extraordinary rate of involvement or opportunity, and the success rate was around 85% of those responses were accurate because the program was well designed. What sort of correction procedures might you use? Do you correct sufficiently well? Do you correct based on what the child has said or done, or do you correct just in a behavioural sort of way by offering positive reinforcement? How specific are your goals? If you're going to assess carefully, you need to know what goals that you have and how they may be defined by shorter term objectives. And the instructor skill, the ability of an instructor to appreciate where a child is at and what is working for them. That, of course, was the original basis for the introduction of specialist teachers. It's useful for both beginning and remedial instruction, though the idea is that if you introduce evidence-based instruction in the first place, you will have far fewer remedial concerns subsequently. So all beginning students entering school would be screened for pre-skills that the evidence has highlighted are necessary for success. and research and validated instruction provided from the beginning. But that would be a big shift for our schools to introduce that. I know some schools do, but it hasn't been the norm. A student with slow progress is then given one or more additional, that is additional to the normal classroom procedures, say for literacy, additional research validated interventions. At this stage it may well be in a group, but it is additional to what they are already receiving. Academic progress is assessed using curriculum-based measures, and we'll talk some more about that, but they for something like this, as they really have the sort of data sets that allow for the acknowledgement of small changes. If there has been no worthwhile change in this intervention, the first step is to check that it is being offered correctly to the child. That is the program being faithfully introduced, or is it only being done twice a week? Or is it being changed? Has the teacher decided to become creative with it? However, if fidelity has been seen and recognised, then the presentation aspects become the next focus. So frequency, duration, group size, or use of a specialist instructor. So there's 3 tiers typically described. This is a fairly simple notion that for 80–85% of students, the general classroom instruction will be quite sufficient for them to make good progress, assuming, of course, that it is an evidence-based initial introduction to literacy. Tier 2 is when your evidence, your data begins to show that some children are not keeping pace. So they continue with their instruction plus some strategic instruction in addition. Then, in the event that this second tier, maybe 10 or 15% of students would fall into that tier, if that series of interventions is unsuccessful, would you go to tier 3, in which you would have a very intensive program. And that could be 5%, it may be even less, depending on how successful you've been with your tier 1 and tier 2 interventions. It's applicable to both academics and behaviour, and as I've indicated, Tier 1, universal, everyone gets that. Tier 2, additional support, it could be something as simple as spending time with a peer tutor, but as long as the data is being kept, it should be evident whether this intervention is having the desired effect. And intensive intervention for Tier 3, as I mentioned before. It could involve further referral for additional assessment, special education services, EdSite, SpeechPath, and small group or individual instruction. You can see from this sort of framework that there is a lot of opportunity for offering response to intervention in quite separate and perhaps different ways. It is not a rigid regimen. Group size has been talked about a couple of times. There's no, in the evidence, no agreed upon number. It does rather depend on a number of factors, including what it is that's being taught, the degree of complexity of it, the skill of the teacher, the quality of the program. From 1 to 1 to as many as 1 to 10 have had research support. And a relatively recent analysis by Wanzek and Vaughan suggested that there is compelling research indicating that groups of 3 to 5 can be as effective as 1 to 1. In this case, even for the most at-risk students. So it does depend on the quality of the program and the intensity of the intervention. The advantages, part of the advantage is to intervene early to meet the needs of struggling learners rather than waiting for a year or more and preventing the Matthew effects in the possibility that there might be such things. The thing about the RTI procedures is that they document which strategies are effective, do provide benefits for individual students, and it does lead to sometimes an uncomfortably high level of accountability for schools. For when students don't make progress, one doesn't use the reason that, well, his brother wasn't very bright either, or his parents have divorced recently and things are falling apart, or he's just a born slow child. The accountability indicates that school should be able to have a significant and enduring effect on any child. How would you estimate a skill gap? There are several ways that one can do that. You could have local norms. Maybe you've been collecting data about your preps and ones, for example, for some years, and you've got some idea of what the local schools are like in terms of expected progress. Or you could use research norms, norms for typical growth based on research sample. And I refer later to the DIBBLES curriculum-based measurements. They have several million students in their database, and they provide norms for reading from P to 6. Or you could have criterion reference benchmarks for a minimum level of competence determined for a skill. And the DIBBLES and AIMSweb and a couple of others also provide those benchmarks indicating which students through the screening may need assistance. Here's one taken from the DIBBLES. This is a free program. It's, I think, a fascinating program of assessment. It's assessment only. And here's just taken at random one small section. Third grade students are considered at low risk for reading problems if they reach these reading fluency goals. Start of the school year, 77 words correct per minute. Middle of school year, 92, and end of school year, 110. There was a fascinating piece of work done in Florida a few years ago in which the year 3 students all did fluency tests, and then those fluency scores were analysed in relation to their FCAT, which is the equivalent of our NAPLAN or AIMS. And they found that almost no students with a fluency measure above 120 failed the comprehension test in their state testing. Those below 90, an extremely high proportion failed the comprehension test. And we've already heard today that there is a relationship between reading, and in particular reading fluency, and comprehension. A criterion reference benchmark, if you look at Ella Tabor's work, a 1 minute letter sound fluency test at year's beginning is the strongest single predictor of a prep child's end of year spelling ability. That's the sort of information that can be extremely useful. If we're going to collect data on children, it needs to be very quick and easy data to collect and to keep. Here's an initial sound fluency that you could use if you were interested in seeing what happens to spelling ability and how closely linked it is with the initial testing of things like phonemic awareness. So the child has shown 4 pictures. Which picture begins with D? And if the child's initial sound fluency is less than 4, they're considered at risk. And so you could use that data to select the children that you want to make sure they don't fall victim of the Matthew effects. The reason for low performance, there could be several, of course. One is the skill deficit, that the child simply can't do the task. The other is it's a fragile skill. And I want to talk a bit about fluency as we go along. The child can do it, but it's so painful that he often loses track of what the task is. Or thirdly, it could be a motivation deficit, and depending on which form of skill deficit, which form of deficit the child is displaying, that would help to change which program you would want to introduce. Ideally, an evidence-based intervention is one that's had articles in peer-reviewed professional journals demonstrating its effectiveness for similar students in similar situations. For example, research on struggling English as a second language students. Not every English as a second language student struggles, but for those who do, Slavin and Chun suggested their analysis of the data indicated that Success for All, which coincidentally is Slavin's program, direct instruction, which is of course the Engelman model, and Jolly Phonics from Chris Jolly in England had strong evidence, which is really interesting because none of them are focused on English as a second language. They just happen to be very good programs that are effective for a wide range of learners. Frequent monitoring, ideally it would be weekly and using reliable, valid measures that are sensitive to short-term gains. And as I've indicated, if schools hope to be able to collect data like this, they need to be brief. So typically we're talking about 1 minute samples. Well, I've talked about CDM probes briefly. They're short-timed assessments in a number of different important areas for literacy and also for mathematics. You can do the same sort of thing for behaviour with report cards and with external observers using observation. It's all about collecting useful data. You would only consider a full assessment, such as calling in the EdPsych or a speech pad, if the interventions that were carried out as designed and the progress monitoring indicated that this simply wasn't working. What's different is that it's a very structured approach, that the whole school can become involved in it. There needs to be a knowledge of scientifically based interventions, and that may not be currently present through our school system, but we're beginning to at least see an appreciation of the potential for teachers to have an enormous influence on their children. In the past, I think teaching was undervalued. It wasn't recognised what it was that teachers did that was effective and what it was that wasn't effective. We're beginning to see now at least a recognition that teacher intervention can be powerful. Now we need to translate that into action in the classroom. So the first step then, if a school were interested in doing so, would be to collect the data, to train teachers to be able to collect the data. And that's not quite so easy either, because that typically hasn't been the way teachers are trained in their pre-service training, and nor has it been a strong Department of Education impetus for that to be taken on. So teacher training, a number of studies, including some of Ruth's, that have been useful in Australia, highlights the fact that teacher training can be a real stumbling block for new teachers, but it also encourages those teachers who are in service to take advantage of the potential for improving their own teaching. What sort of training is effective is an interesting notion we've all been through in services, rather like this one, perhaps, where we talk about theory and some discussion. The use in the classroom is typically 0%. So is demonstration in training. So if I ran a lesson with you, for example, as students, the impact on your classroom would be 0. With practice and feedback, however, in training, if you get some feedback on your efforts, there is likely to be some change in your classroom, but not dramatically, until someone comes into your classroom who is skilled in the program that you are discussing and actually coaches you and provides feedback. Then you start to see change in classrooms. A few things about fluency, because it's an area that is stressed in this particular response to intervention literature. It's often thought that if a child can do something, then that should be the criterion for mastery. But in fact, a number of writers and subsequent evidence has built to indicate that fluency should be our criterion for mastery, not simply whether a child can do something, but how easily, rapidly, how automatically they can do it. So that which would be assessing the capacity of children to achieve the tasks in maths and literacy and so on, if we are interested in true mastery. So the fluency levels, initially incompetence, no measurable performance. Then you get beginner's level, where a child is inaccurate and slow. And of course, we still see this in some children in secondary school. Then 100% accuracy. You will often see with good phonics programs, children can become much more accurate at decoding the words that are there. But fluency, that is the ability to read automatically and with reasonable speed, is something that's rather difficult to achieve. Practice is a crucial component of that, as John has pointed out earlier, and curriculum design, how well designed is the curriculum. Those two things are very important. And fluency can also be an additional guide to a child who seriously is going to have problems with literacy in particular. Dibbles has a number of other fluency measures, so not just initial sound, but how many initial sounds can you produce in a minute? Same with letter naming. We know letter naming or letter sounds are very important, but don't just test whether a child can name or sound 26 letters. Actually see how long it takes, because the difference across a classroom is quite marked, and it adds to the predictive value of what you're doing. And so on with other tests. In the clinic at RMIT, a test that I used a lot was called the Towerer, the test of word reading efficiency. So it tests nonsense words and word lists, but it also measures 45-second block, measures how rapidly students are able to read these, and it gives us a lot of information. Some other free measures, Ames Web, you just need to register with them. Easy CDM is not one that I've used, but came across recently. What you're getting here is graded passages, maybe 15 passages for each year, and so you're able to use those as your collection device. I also recommend the Intervention Central website, a really excellent website. Also on my webpage at RMIT, there are a lot of resources mentioned. Here's an example of a Ainsworth Year 3 oral reading passage. The child has a copy without the word number, cumulative word number list, and the teacher fills in errors and counts the number of words that's read in 1 minute. And that becomes your data set for that particular oral reading. Here's an example of collecting some data and then graphing it. This is a child who's been set a 2.5 correct words per minute per week fluency target improvement. So the child, we hope with the intervention, will improve by 2.5 words per week in fluency. She starts at 30 words a minute, and there's a baseline for the first 2 weeks, not a lot of change, somewhere around 30 words per minute. And an intervention is introduced between weeks 2 and 8. And there's some initial change, but then you see that 3 data points occur below the line. 3 data points here tell you that this program there's something not working here. So then a different program or a modification to the program is made, and then you start to see that the data points falling just above and just below the line, and at the end of the 14 weeks the child's reached the target of 55 correct words per minute. So the improvement was about 2.5 words per week. Sounds piffling, I know, but not to the child, because every improvement in their fluency has a significant compounding effect that also improves their engagement, and typically they begin to read a bit more and start to comprehend better as well. So fluency is a critical variable, one we haven't paid enough attention to in our schools. It improves retention. Things that you know perfectly, that you can recall instantly, stick in your memory. And when children develop fluency, it is likely that they will retain the information or the skill. Resistance to distraction. We know distraction is a great problem for children, and it isn't always attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It isn't always misbehaviour. Sometimes it is just that children are easily distracted because they don't have instant access to things like their number tables, or things like being able to read a passage without too many errors and get the meaning from it. There's just an example of some oral reading fluency data from grades 1 to 8, and it gives you an idea of the 50th percentile. So here's a Year 4 child at fall, that's autumn, that's the first part of their school year, of course. 94 words per minute, correct, you would expect at the beginning of Year 4 for the average child. If you take the average range as the 25th to the 75th percentile, a range between 68 and 119 should represent about half of the students in your grade. I find it a very useful chart when we're assessing students. Sometimes it is suggested that dyslexia represents a whole different ballgame, but the evidence so far, and maybe it will one day, but the evidence so far doesn't seem to bear that out. The evidence suggests that the same good teaching that is effective for other children can also be effective for children who have been diagnosed with dyslexia, but it may well mean greater intensity, a greater attention to instructional detail, and increased duration of program to get an effect. Sometimes we can introduce a program and say, well, that doesn't seem to have worked at all, when what we need to do is keep close data, but don't give up too soon. Where do I find evidence-based programs? There's a range of reviews of evidence-based program in this information here, and the references I've used I've provided there too. Some other resources on response to intervention. And then finally, can I acknowledge that I pinched shamelessly some of this material from Carl Binder and also from Jim Wright. Thank you.
Okay, I'll open it up for questions at the moment. Just so I've got an idea of how much time we're going to take for questions, how many people do have questions for the four presenters? Okay, I was going to bring chairs in, but perhaps then we can just come and stand up here. Okay. So I've always said in my clinical practice that reading and recovery trained teachers have really good skills, and that some of the things that are good about reading and recovery are just good teaching practice. So things like exposure to text and measurement of goals and attention and the therapeutic relationship you have with the child are all just about good instruction. We've heard today from John that based upon data, reading and recovery can be an effective program. On the other hand, we've heard from Tom that even though the data says it can be an effective program, his research and others shows that more explicit teaching of the alphabetic principle or phonics skills can add to the effectiveness of the strategies that are a core component of reading and recovery. And that including those types of strategies can produce larger gains than reading and recovery alone. And it's also probably worth pointing out that it's an expensive method. So that the question is, can we produce similar gains in a more cost-effective way? So I guess that then poses the question to us as educators: do we keep reading and recovery and attempt to make it better? Maybe. The alternatives are perhaps to use other programs that do provide more explicit instruction in those other skills, as well as keeping the good things about reading and recovery, which, as I said, are generally just good teaching practice. And I think the points that Kerry's made about gathering data are really important. I think it's vital that teachers act more like scientists. So we're responsible as educators to be aware of the effects of what we're doing. And while the big meta-analyses that people like Max and John do work on huge data sets at the local level, if you like, we can use our students as case studies, and with good measurement, we can decide whether we're being effective or not. And I think it's also important to be flexible. So if something appears not to be working, you need to change quickly. As Kerry's examples showed there with his fluency measures, where 3 or 4 data points shows you a trend, and we've got to be able to be flexible and change quickly. So that's it from me. We'll open it up to the floor for questions.